Just as a reminder, my name is Claire Noon. I'm a local attorney, and I have a human rights and immigration kind of focus, as well as environmental and estate planning, kind of trying to balance out the crisis work. But of course, now almost everything is crisis work. Um, and I am here to kind of help. Uh, Guide the civics education from kind of the larger scope of government and the people in general to now we're kind of moving into the individual rights, what violations have occurred, and what can be done, you know, in our lives going forward. Um, just as kind of a reminder, from last week, we were talking about the foundations of U.S. democracy by the, Declaration of Independence and what it meant to imagine an entire new way of governing, one that moved from a sovereign and subjects to representatives and the people. The power that the governing body has is directly given by the governed. That was a new and revolutionary way of envisioning governments and functioning of societies. And that even though it's been 250 years, the world in a lot of ways um, is nothing like the world of the founding fathers. And so the expectations of this kind of established doctrine to be able to adapt and anticipate our new world um, is unrealistic. And so not only do we have the opportunity to imagine a new way, but we have the obligation as well because we now are we have different needs, different priorities, different experiences, and our society and our government can and should keep up with it. I'm going to speak about particularly the Bill of Rights to begin with, but I just kind of wanted to remind everyone kind of the bigger picture of the US um, system of government. We are a system that gets its consent of the governed, creates the power of the government through representative democracy. So we elect and send to make the laws people from our local districts. As you know, that has changed greatly how many people are in this country, how many different lived experiences. And so the ability of the representatives to actually represent the people has, it's been it never was truly meant to represent everyone, and we've only kind of moved further away from that reality. Um, the idea of the US kind of system is that the people, that it's kind of understood that tyranny is a way of being in human society, that when few people have power, that power inherently corrupts, it inherently kind of contorts and is intended to perpetuate the powerful. So in order to counter that and in order to ensure the wellness and the rights of the people, there needs to be protections against that governmental abuse and overreach. So that is what the US Constitution is. It is not something that gives from the government to people these rights. It is a protection shield that the people have from the government. And I think that that is a conceptual thing that gets lost often when we talk about the Constitution and the government and kind of what our role is. There's this feeling that government is afflicted upon us rather than um, that we have kind of an active role to play. Um, so the way that we can think about the individual rights. The United States, in many ways, is built upon individual identity and the concept of individuality. Um, and some would say that it's become a little, far too much individuality, that we've lost the ability to relate as community. And in some ways, technology and just kind of the modern world has made that true all over the world. But When you pair that with the American kind of fierce individual identity that not only can we all have the individual power and autonomy to do and to create what we want, we also have the individual responsibility of participating in our government, participating in our communities, and I think that that kind of dual um, burden and benefit, burden and blessing, has been lost somehow. Um, Again, we are a government by the people, for the people, by the people, of the people, for the people. And when the majority is not represented, the rights of few are taking over and causing harm to the rights of the many. That is when Congress and the government can step in to redistribute the sources and the experiences of power. And so when we spoke last week, it was very much about the concept of power. I think that we often think of our individual role in government is we just, we can nominate and give our power through voting to another person to go and do our bidding in Congress and in government, or we can be harmed and we can go to court. But really, when we think about the power that we have in a democracy and in a community collective, that is a very limited idea of what that power is. We also have the power to establish social norms, the power of collective voices, the power of protest, the power of lots of different ways to exert our will and exert our influence on the kind of greater governmental powers. So this was, I wish you could have seen, I wish you could see this a little bit better, but this is just kind of a reminder of what are the founding principles of the US democratic system. And just to remind, it's the natural rights, that there are certain inalienable rights, and alienation is actually like to sell or to exchange. So these rights cannot be bought, sold, or given, or they are inalienable. They exist separate from government, before and after, and that those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So liberty, equality, and justice. Those are the kind of founding principles of the US democratic system. And we're going to talk today about ways in which those kind of foundations are being tested, stretched, broken in the treatment and the experience of individuals, particularly marginalized individuals in this moment in time. Again, the consent of the governed is what kind of gives the source of the authority for the government to do everything it does. That includes, taxes, military, all of that power that is not expressly given is retained by the people. Limited government, there's this idea that there's the rule of law that applies to everyone. No one is above the law, president, Supreme Court justice, rich, poor, male, female. The concept is that there's a rule of law that everyone has to abide by. There's not this kind of different class of rules or obligations based on identity, that you are equally in front of the law and protected by the law. And in order to ensure that, we have due process, which ensures that there is a procedure with which people can expect and be in front of the law, regardless of who they are. In order to ensure this kind of equality and no one being more powerful than another, we have the separation of powers. So taking that sovereign and splitting it into three heads, having the legislative, executive, and judiciary, that no one branch can become corrupted and tyrannical. That is the kind of vision. And then through that, we have further clarified and further identified rights of individuals. And this includes freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom to privacy. So we'll talk more about that. But those are kind of the big founding principles of the US democratic dream. And as you can, just from hearing those kind of said aloud in this moment, I'm sure you all are already thinking of ways that that is not the reality. And so thinking of what can we do to either move closer to that ideal or move to a different way of being and existing that upholds those ideals. Oops. So last week we also spoke about to be a citizen is not just a status that's granted by birth or petition under the government. It is a verb, and it is something that comes with that obligation and responsibility. So there's kind of four pillars of citizening as a verb. The first is to citizen is to invest in relationships. So that is within the self, within the community, within the government, within, understanding who we are living with and making collective decisions with those people. To citizen is also to understand power. And that's what I was talking about earlier, to be fluent in power, the various ways we can use it for collective benefit. To citizen is also to participate, to show up for each other publicly and participate in the ways that include going beyond voting, including go beyond voting. So I think that the concept that we all kind of every 4 years or every 2 to 4 years with midterms show up and do our democratic, civic duty, vote, get a sticker and move on, does us all a disservice and is a misunderstanding of what it means to be an engaged citizen and member of the collective. And finally, the citizen is to value the collective, to work towards outcomes that benefit the many, not just the few. And that is something that I think we're kind of shifting in our kind of what is understood about the kind of two-party system, the politicians as a representative of the people, is that at least, as was articulated kind of up until the modern era, the last 15 years, I'd say, was that both political parties, all political representatives, genuinely wanted the best interest of the American people, of the general middle class, kind of regardless of who was elected, who voted, that there was a kind of sense of the common good. And what we're seeing in this, kind of modern time, through kind of the isolation and separation and othering of people inside the country and outside the country, there is this kind of antagonizing element that moves away from that general public good and being a representative of the people. The people themselves have become kind of segmented off, and that some are entitled to rights and dignities and others aren't. And that is a very scary place to be. So this is just kind of a reminder that to citizen is to invest in relationships, to understand power, to participate, and to value the collective. And that, intentionally is done without kind of partisan values placed upon it. This is just the kind of fundamental vision of a citizen and how the democratic system that we, that is structured around us, that kind of the dream of it requires this kind of citizenship from all people, regardless of actual identified citizenship under the Immigration and Nationality Act. So to get into what it is to be an individual within the United States, we'll talk about the Bill of Rights. So one of the greatest contributions, regardless of where we are today, regardless of their actual, creation and the motivations behind the creation, one of the greatest contributions that the United States has ever made to the world is the Bill of Rights. And that was a revolutionary concept that regardless of class, power, gender, anything, regardless of who someone is, they are entitled to certain protections, that there are rights, and that the idea of an individual having rights and not just a system having rights, or that the individuals serve an economic and a kind of monarchical system, that the system serves the individuals. And so the Bill of Rights has been kind of that rock that ripples across the world, and that has been adopted and morphed and changed, but has truly shifted and changed the world as we know it, and how we conceptualize individuals and government. So regardless of where we are and where we're going, the heritage that we have, the inheritance of these documents and these ideals, is truly revolutionary to the world. So the Bill of Rights is the U.S. Constitution, was drafted, and then the amendments came after. And again, the Constitution was to protect from government overreach, and these Bill of Rights kind of further clarified, what kind of overreach is not accepted, what kind of protections can individuals expect, and kind of enabled the collective experience of these rights to become more clear. It's important to note already that when this was created, when the Bill of Rights was, over several years they came into being, but they did not include women, to the full extent. They did not include formerly enslaved people. They did not include enslaved people. They did not include Native Americans. There was a lot of asterisks to the Bill of Rights. Again, imperfect, but the concept of them remains significant. And I'm sure many of these rights, again, have been, they're a part of the general kind of discussion about what it is to be alive right now. We have the First Amendment right, the freedom of expression. We all are very familiar with that. That means, that you can say what you believe without, essentially you can express yourself and your opinion, even if it's unpopular. You may criticize the president, Congress, your neighbor, without fear of retaliation. And that is kind of a foundation of the necessary cultivation of new ideas requires this kind of freedom of expression. Also within the freedom of expression, so we'll talk more about the freedom of expression, but there's the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, the freedom of assembly, and the freedom of petition. So this is kind of, speech is considered kind of any expression of your consciousness, of your thoughts, and of your ideas. So that can be through art, through social media, through a protest, standing on the street with a sign. There are certain protections that you should have a reasonable expectation of that kind of expression. Now, of course, in a society, there's always that balancing of the individual right and the public good. And so there are limitations. All of these rights have their kind of grand ideals. And then there's kind of caveats and carve outs, that say like, well, you can say, freedom of speech, but you can't yell fire in a crowded auditorium, because people's rights to safety and to, is also important within the context of these rights. So there are carve-outs, and important to say, the freedom of speech is definitely a powerful, one of the most powerful rights that we have, but that does not extend. You cannot libel, slander, lie about someone, harm them. There's lots of protections to that, to an individual from the harm of speech of another. It's important to note, though, that with any kind of libel, slander, defamation claim, like truth is the ultimate defense. So you can always speak the truth. You can't make things up in order to harm someone else or the government. Truth is always a defense to one of those claims. So I think that in this moment, when we know misinformation is kind of rampant, when we know that the ability of people to trust, different what's being said, it's important to note that truth is absolute in some contexts. And if you can prove that what you are saying is true, you can say it. As long as it does not take away the rights of another or unduly harm the public. The second right in the Bill of Rights is the right to bear arms. And we all are very familiar. This is one of the more openly discussed and openly represented rights through the NRA, through kind of lobbyists. That right to, ultimately, that is kind of the largest expression of that the people have the right to defend themselves from the government. We have a lot of, kind of theoretical rights like that, but the right to bear arms is actually the government. We know tyranny is nature, and that it will, ultimate power ultimately corrupts, and that when that happens, people need to have at least the ability or the chance to defend themselves against that kind of government overreach. There's so much to be said about this, but it is worth noting that the right to bear arms kind of remains antiquated in how it is. The concept is to meet or be able to match the ability to commit violence that the government has. The people need to be able to match that, and of course that carve out of the public good. We've seen weapons being used against the people and harming in great ways, but when you look at the capacity of the U.S. military, it's kind of, there's having a gun or something, it's kind of difficult to see how that kind of parity of, the nuclear weapons and drones and all of this stuff, and then matching it with the individual rights of gun ownerships. That kind of has not evolved, nor am I saying it should evolve to match the might of the U.S. military, but I just think that it's important to note that is the intention, is that the ability to bring about, exert power, have someone do what you would will them to do through violence remains primarily, the government has that power in relation to the people, regardless of this right that we have carved out. In reality, that violence remains disproportionate. The Third Amendment has always been very kind of like a antiquated one as well. It's that no quartering of soldiers in private residences. So this was when, like, if someone was if there was military in the town of Paonia fighting off Chinese military presence, the Third Amendment prevents the U.S. Military from taking over our homes for housing of soldiers. So this has been kind of a sleeper right, but now that we are seeing kind of the federalization of the National Guard and other kind of threats or fears of a militarized interior, this may become more relevant, in the coming years, depending on which way our country goes. The Fourth Amendment is the right against unreasonable searches and seizures. This is one of the ones that I'm going to talk about most explicitly, because it is a search, obviously, is the search of property. So a home, a car, a backpack, patting down your body. And a seizure is an arrest, an individual's physical arrest. You seize the body, and a seizure of property, phone, a bag from your car, money, all of that. And so reasonableness, the kind of reasonableness standard, is that there's probable cause of a crime or a connection to a crime being committed. The Fourth Amendment, it's worth very clearly stating, which I should have said at the very beginning, the whole Constitution minus voting and all of the Bill of Rights applies to every living, breathing human in the United States territories, regardless of anything else. So the right against unreasonable search and seizures in the context of immigration is very relevant right now, because we are seeing that being violated. And I'm going to speak about it more in just a moment, but the idea that unless you are a citizen, unless you have money and can fight with an attorney, you should just expect your home being invaded, your body being arrested and taken away without having the opportunity to challenge or to know the charges against you. That and the Fifth Amendment, which I'm going to get into right now, is the due process. Fifth and 14th Amendment is the due process clause, which is substantive and procedural due process, which essentially is what is the kind of the piece that ties together all of our ability to access any of our rights, is the ability to have due process. So due process is ensures a level of fundamental fairness for individuals from government overreach. So it essentially says that the government cannot take life, the death penalty, liberty, arrest you, deport you, or property, your phone, invade your take your car, take, anything like that, without providing due process. And due process has been, is constantly being clarified and kind of allowed to evolve through the courts. Each kind of case that is passed that kind of expands or restricts due process rights enables that kind of very antiquated drafting to keep up with cars, because when they wrote the due process clause, they did not consider vehicle stops. What can someone do? What kind of rights do people have? With their cell phones, those kind of concepts were not even on the table when the Bill of Rights and the Constitution were created. So to expect, that evolution to occur is difficult. But generally speaking, that if anyone, is, being arrested, having the property taken, about to be killed, about to be deported, they have the opportunity of notice and the opportunity to be heard in front of a fair and impartial decision maker. That means the notice required has to be specific, certain, that you have, and you have notice of the case the government has against you, the evidence they have against you, the charges, the potential judgment, all of that. You have the right to know what's going on, essentially. And then the opportunity to be heard means that you have the opportunity to know your rights, have an attorney, and then speak about, present evidence, present testimony, have a trial, have, witnesses and a jury. All of these things are kind of built into due process. And it has to be an impartial decision maker. So having, for instance, an ICE court make the decision on an ICE arrest is not an impartial decision maker. A jury is, pretty clearly seen as an impartial decision maker because it is a jury of peers that have been what's called voir dire, where each side have the opportunity to question and, veto some selections and until they reach kind of a mutually agreeable set of jurors. A independent judiciary is a very strong and important part of this right and the due process rights under the Constitution. If the courts are beholden to a certain outcome or donors or re-election, things like that, that all kind of weakens the impartiality of the decision maker. When we are talking about kind of the rights of due process, I'm going to speak for a moment on kind of what's happening in the immigration sphere. The United States has clear rules and laws about who has the right to, be present in the United States, who has the right to work in the United States, who has the right to vote, like based upon certain status of immigration status. And that is another antiquated thing. The last time we really had an expansion of classification of rights or kind of evolution into the modern era was after World War II, when kind of the right to asylum was really enshrined as we know it today. And that was informed by World War II and the Holocaust, and that there was actually a ship that was with German Jews coming from, fleeing the Holocaust, tried to enter a port in the United States and was turned away. And everyone on that ship was actually returned back to the Holocaust and died. So that kind of collective knowledge of, oh, we have some sort of, this isn't what is happening in the world. We have some sort of obligation as the land of the free and the land of opportunity to extend safety and extend some sort of protection under particular circumstances. And so this has never been, the right to asylum has never been open and kind of vague, like, yeah, sure, come on in as long as you want, whatever. Asylum is very restricted, and it has only become more and more and more and more and more restricted. But essentially, you have to be able to prove that for something that you are being persecuted in your home country, and it's based on an immutable personal characteristic, so something that can't be changed. So it can't be like, oh, I have purple hair and so they're discriminating against me, I need protection. It has to be like, I am white or I am black, and this here is the persecution that's occurring. Sexual orientation, sexual identity is a mutable characteristic. Religion is considered immutable in the United States Constitution because we see the right to freedom of religion, certain things like that. And things that have occurred in the past, like your participation in political sphere, your ethnic identity, things like that, your language, things like that. And the persecution needs to be by your home government or by someone that your home government is unable or unwilling to protect you against. That's really, really important, because that's in World War II, the kind of entities that were committing harm against people were states, formal governments, states with, boundaries, borders, obligations, citizens, things like that. So it was a very clear, like, either your government is helping you or not, and your government's either harming you or not. Since then, as you know, as technology and kind of globalization has expanded, the significance of a state has kind of gone a little bit away and been replaced by these kind of multinational, transnational organizations, entities. Particularly, I did a lot of work in the first Trump administration with asylum seekers on the southern border. So people who were fleeing on foot from Central American countries, who were experiencing persecution, violence, and the threat of harm, not by their home government, but by these transnational gangs that their home governments were unable or unwilling to protect them from. But ultimately, the very nuanced requirements of the asylum laws really restrict the receipt of asylum it's a really low approval rate. Most people, um, under the kind of just definitions today, even though like I meet with like with children in tent cities who are fleeing violence, um, and I'm just like trying to kind of like, okay, but what about this? Nope, that doesn't fit. Like you don't fit the classification of asylum. We're gonna have to try another potential avenue. Even knowing people with very legitimate fears, like on the kind of the essence of asylum, should receive it based upon the kind of lack of evolution and the restrictions of the laws it's written. Most people won't apply, won't qualify. And so this is just to kind of couch the entire idea of being an immigrant in the United States. Is not as straightforward as getting in line and doing it the right way. You know, doing what why can't you just, figure it out? There's these kind of really, really old school understandings of immigration law and immigration reality that really have they could not be further from the truth, quite frankly. The numbers of visas that are granted are shrinking. The numbers of work authorization, the numbers of asylum, acceptances, the kind of qualifications, temporary protected status is being shrunk and eliminated. The ability of the United States to really represent itself as a nation of immigrants and a land of protection and security is really going away with how we are administering the immigration laws, like who can enter and who can remain. So what that means is that a lot of people, not the majority, but there's a significant portion of the United States that have either entered on lawful status by a visa, by parole, and then had that status has uh, expired. And so now they are on what's called a visa overstay, or they were brought as a child and had no, ability to apply for a status themselves. And so they, got DACA, but DACA has not been updated or, approved for any sort of pathway to citizenship. So there's a lot of people who, for no fault of their own, like no nefarious attempt to manipulate the system, are in the United States without status or protection. So what that means is that rather than having committed a crime, it is not a crime to be unlawfully in the United States. It is a civil violation, it's just like a traffic violation that is not criminal and therefore does not come with the automatic right to an attorney. Well, you have the right to an attorney, but not the automatic provision of an attorney as does the criminal code. So that makes it even more difficult for people to actually receive due process in a place that the access to attorneys is very low. When people are approached or engaged by ICE, the constitutional rights, are existent. You have the right to notice, why am I being arrested? Who is arresting me? What agency are you belonging to? Where am I being taken? Those kind of very basic due process rights. And then the opportunity to be heard in front of a impartial decision maker. Go in front of a judge. Go in front of a put on a case before the kind of irreparable harm of deportation, potentially to a third country, potentially to a country where they are fleeing persecution. And those rights are not that they don't exist, they exist. And like that's the kind of the kind of crux of it is that the rights are there. It's just that people are not aware of them, or people don't know how to express them. And so therefore they're being violated without knowledge. And the Supreme Court has held that in order for due process to be upheld, the person needs to, be spoken to in a language that they understand, receive, time and adequate opportunity to review a warrant. These laws are all very laid out and explained further in how you can actually have protection under due process. But the way that the immigration enforcement has been going, we have individuals with masks on, so you aren't able to have notice of who is arresting me and why am I being arrested. Warrants are not being shared if they are existent. People, the searches and seizures, people's bodies are being taken off the street to places that their families are unable to reach them. Attorneys are unable to reach them. And then they're, having consequences without the opportunity to be heard in front of an impartial decision maker. So we are in a time where we're seeing these rights and these kind of established protections being blatantly violated, kind of on a procedural, like systemic scale. It's one thing there, and there's always individual in any industry, in any kind of sector that abuse power. That's kind of an expected group of people, but it is the expectation and the governmental purpose that the system itself have rule of law and have procedures for if there are violations, for how to address them, expectations on what uniform to wear, on what to communicate, on how to promote safety and knowledge. That is all expected as part of the rule of law and due process, that if there are some outliers in how they are treating individuals, that is handled, and that is not incorporated and kind of brought into the general practice of an entire governmental agency. So what we're seeing now in that it's an instructional, we've seen memos, we've seen training procedures for ICE that is now, going to be expanding by 10,000 agents. We are seeing this kind of expansion of not just the allowance of these violations, but the kind of procedural standardization of these violations. And so I think a lot of people, citizens, people who feel more protected in their status in the United States, there's kind of this like cognitive dissonance that says, well, if they're being, treated in that way, that must be because the agents know something about them. They're like, an escaped murderer or some sort of like, there has to be something that separates them from me. Because what happened if unidentified, unwarranted kidnappings can occur to one person, they can occur to another. And I think that it's important. I think I have it. The kind of removal, we've had U.S. citizens in detention and deported. We've had people with legal status. There's mistakes being made left and right. And that is kind of how that kind of rapid expansion of a practice. ICE has been, in the interior pretty dormant and, really going after these prioritized cases, like someone who is a escaped murderer or someone who has a domestic violence conviction. Those are who ICE has been going after. But this kind of opening up of just go after anyone who is not a natural born citizen essentially means that there's going to be bringing on of people without really good training, a lack of kind of cohesive planning and understanding of the roles of law enforcement. And then that expansion, that means that they're getting too big and they're breaking things in the process, and they're breaking that due process right. According to, there's kind of this understanding that, well, if you have status, then you should present that when you're being arrested or questioned or interrogated or something like that. And based upon the U.S. Immigration Citizenship Service, USCIS, who is like the administrative side of ICE, in order to show proof of citizenship for to be a United States citizen, you have to have your birth certificate you issued like formally, U.S. passport, certificate of citizenship, which is for someone who is born on like a military base, or a naturalization certificate, which was someone who like becomes a citizen through process. So without one of those four documents, you or I, presuming that you are a natural born citizen, without who have never had to think about this before, those are the documents that they say, if you don't have them, we don't know you're a citizen. And if we don't know you're a citizen, we're going to treat you as a non-citizen. And if we're treating you like a non-citizen, we're going to remove you. We're going to arrest and detain you first, ask questions later. So by expanding any arm of the government to allow that kind of harm to be brought upon people without due process, invariably leads to that violation trickling out and extending to all people. And I think that it's kind of a trope to say, as to the immigrants, so to citizens. And first they came for the immigrant, but I'm not an immigrant, so I said nothing. That poem, there's these kind of ideas that like injustice anywhere is an injustice everywhere. Like that kind of idea is not really translated into an understanding of my individual rights. If anyone can take someone off the street or enter their home, enter their car without due process, that can happen to me as well. And we're seeing increasingly sophisticated ways of invading privacy of individuals for purposes of immigration enforcement and other purposes that we're not really sure what can happen. But if we don't have these individual protections for everyone, we really have them for no one. And when that happens, when that has transpired, what do we do as a people to either stand up and kind of rein back in the government, expand our shield of protection, or do we kind of do as they, obey in advance and start to kind of turn on each other and attempt to separate from the people who are, more marginalized and needing care and support and advocacy. The right to privacy is a big one. Last week we spoke about DOJ and how the private information of millions of U.S. Residents, taxpayers, healthcare recipients has been consolidated and kind of shared and used kind of in an amorphous, unknown way. We have Palantir, these kind of different surveillance and anticipatory enforcement technologies, like AI being used to look at like a series of actions or a series of, like, if someone is in a place more than 3 times, the likelihood of them then going on to go to another place is going to be 50%. So you can arrest at 70%, like using these kind of predictive technologies through kind of privacy invasion to say that you are going to commit a crime, so therefore they have the right to enforce to prevent you from committing a crime. That kind of those kind of violations are happening. I'm sure you've heard of flock cameras, or not, maybe not. They're a technology that is kind of those traffic cameras that, rather than being owned by like the city of Delta and looking for people who speed through this one traffic light, using that data to send out tickets and kind of keeping it all in-house. These flock cameras are just watching and tracking and logging every car that drives by a certain spot, noticing if it's a pattern, if the same car goes by like 30 times, it sends it to, you know, there's a way to access that information. That information is consolidated just from that kind of streaming viewing. And then that information is being given to Immigration Customs Enforcement for enforcement of people. So they can, without you having the opportunity to say, actually, I'm a US citizen, or actually, I have an asylum processing that I have a claim, the case is being done, without, opportunity to kind of match and be heard. Doge is kind of a big test again for what the people will accept as far as data breaching. I think that the fact that Elon Musk was removed from kind of the position of government, I think that there's a lot of kind of like, oh, it was a failure, it didn't really work. Where the information that was gathered, it's unknown what it was used for, what it will be used for, where it has gone. So in a lot of senses, it was successful in that it tested the ability of, a few musketeers to go into our institutions that we have trusted with data and with information in order to exist in the United States. Like you have to pay taxes, you have to, provide information for, schools and things like that. That information now being used to antagonize and restrict the rights of individuals should be very, very strongly noted and resisted against. Really quickly, before I transition, it is the right of everyone to know what information the government has on you. So it's under the Privacy Act. Every individual can request their file from the government, say, who has my personally identifiable information? Where is it? What is it being used for? You have the right to know that information under the Privacy Act. And I will, in my toolkit that I'm going to be sharing when I kind of get back on my feet, we'll have kind of how to do that. How do you find out what information's been had on you or been gathered on you, and how do you find out what to do if you think there's been a violation or a breach? Just a quick note: the Attorney General of Colorado and the United States, and the Department of Justice, and the Department Department of Law, I think is what it's called on the state level. Those are that's the intention, is that if there is a breach, then they you can seek redress through those avenues. The other area of kind of privacy and transparency that the people have the right to know is through the Freedom of Information Act and the Colorado Open Records Act. Any document that is held, used, or associated with a private or a public act, so all meetings of agencies, policies, things like that, the people have a right to view and to understand them. And so you can, I will also include with this, do a Freedom of Information Act request with agencies, or a Colorado Open Records request with local organizations and institutions. Any governmental agency has to give you that information. Now, there are, of course, again, balancing the public and the private interests. That redacted information, ongoing cases, that all can kind of be whittled down, and so you don't get everything. But that is a right and a muscle that, when we're having a government that is less transparent with what's happening, kind of attempting to manipulate optics, these are tools that we have until we don't. And I think that is kind of the understanding: don't obey in advance. Don't think that we don't have the right to this information or to really know what's happening just because they won't tell us, or the press can't attend briefings, things like that. Relying upon those in power to provide that information, I think, is a misstep by the people. We have these rights to the information, and we can exert it. I will say I have been wielding that tool rather broadly under this administration, not necessarily against the administration itself, but against local entities who are kind of taking a note under the kind of lack of transparency and oversight, and effectively abusing Colorado law. Specifically in Garfield County, there's a task force that is local law enforcement and immigration customs enforcement, Department of Drug and firearms, and there's a few other kind of federal agencies that the idea is that they all are working together on some kind of bigger crimes. However, when you're in a task force, the individual representatives still have their obligations to their own legal kind of requirements and their own kind of home organization. So like a member of the Garfield County Sheriff cannot do immigration enforcement just by the nature of being a part of this task force with immigration enforcement officers. However, that has been what's happening in the Roaring Fork Valley. Almost exclusively, we have not seen really straight immigration, raids or ICE kind of, rolling in ICE vehicles. It has very much been as a ride along with the Garfield County Sheriff, or because they can pull over and then ICE shows up and arrest the person who's driving. Or I'm working on a case right now where an individual was followed for a few days by an unmarked vehicle, and then at Walmart in Glenwood, came out that unmarked vehicle is right next to a sheriff vehicle. They just approached him, did not ask his name, did not identify or anything, and said, just had a spear, kind of the task force polo on, and said, "You're arrested for immigration violations." Got in a Garfield County Sheriff's vehicle and drove past all of the Garfield County Sheriff booking headquarters and was taken to the gas station in DeBeck, where he was then transferred into the custody of ICE. No kind of booking of charges, no warrant, no nothing. And that's the kind of action that is explicitly out against the law and in violation of due process and individual rights. And so I cannot find, there is no publicly available information about the task force, who is a member, what is what are the different roles, how can they ensure that those roles are upheld, what is who pays for the insurance when Garfield County Sheriff is driving a immigration detainee, like all of the logistics. And then there's nothing available at all. And so I did a CORA request for the organizational documents and communications between the Garfield County Sheriff and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, either through or separate from a task force. And while we are entitled and legally able to get the documents, those are free. You can pay for copies, but digitally it's free. You can be charged. You are charged for the time it takes for the employees, the labor, to do the investigating, which makes sense. If they have to dig through something, do a ton of redacting, it's gonna, you need to compensate for that. I got the largest quote I have ever even heard of for something like this. In requesting the kind of formational organizational documents of this task force and those communications, I was quoted that it would take 480 hours for them to find and cost me $14,000. So needless to say, that either is evidence of very deep enmeshment between the organizations that is highly problematic, or it's an attempt to use that to block the right of transparency and access under these laws. But either way, it's incredibly alarming. And so I am actively kind of using this tool and kind of responding to that denial, essentially, with the Attorney General, and trying to kind of see what can be done in the public interest, because ultimately these documents and these records should be held by the public. Everyone should have the opportunity to review them and to know what their rights are in relation. So if they get pulled over, someone wearing a spear outfit, they know that that is different than a local police officer. They know that's different than ICE. They know that they don't have to share. ICE cannot compel any contact, any interaction without a valid judicial warrant signed by a judge or probable cause that you're committing immigration violation. So they can't ask you well, they will ask you name. You can't be compelled to give your name, date of birth, immigration status, country of origin, any of that without a valid judicial warrant. But if you know that right, and someone comes up to your car, how do you know how to interact with them if they're not clearly identifying themselves under an agency?